So what I wanted to talk about today were some of the literary devices used in Revelation that hopefully we can apply not only reading Revelation, but also through some of the other prophecies and books of the Bible anytime we're reading them. A couple of the main methods that people use to interpret Revelation right now, so we can start to get a perspective on why people say some of the things that they say. And review, this will be the majority of it, but review some of the symbology in particular. So some of the four horsemen and things that we talked about briefly last week. We'll go into a little bit more detail this time. I know you sent out the video, so I guess we'll probably skip.
Anybody watch the video that I sent?
I did.
It's such a cool video.
Thank you. Did it help understand things?
So one of the things, I'm not going to go into detail about this too much, but as we're starting to read, and it specifically applies to the video, is there are several separate and distinct sections in Revelation. So as you're reading through it, you can keep in mind that it's not necessarily a singular flowing storyline. There's separate bits and pieces that are broken down and kind of intended to be read separately. But this part is what I always find super interesting. I want to talk really quickly about three things in particular that show up in Revelation really quickly. And one is the use of symbols. And some of the main things that people use symbols for today are to help set a stage, set a feeling, set an idea without actually digging into and explaining all the background behind it. So one of the questions I have is, what does this actually mean to anybody? When you look at this picture, what does it evoke or symbolize or mean? Anybody?
Somebody's got to say something.
Freedom.
Nobody wants to sit on the couch. In fact, I'm going to sit on the couch. Freedom.
It means you're tired, you're poor, your other masses yearning to be free. I didn't be letting my leg decide to go and see.
Wow, she knows the second verse.
I didn't know the second verse. Well done.
What else?
The USA, just generally.
So who knows where it came from?
France.
France.
Who knows when it got here?
Latter part of the 19th century.
1884 to be specific.
It's supposed to be a gift for 1876 for the first 100 years, but they didn't get it done on time.
I didn't know that.
Okay.
Yeah. Who designed it or engineered it, I suppose?
Who?
Eiffel.
Eiffel designed the structure.
Do you know what it's modeled after?
That's in Eiffel Tower.
Bartholdi was the designer and designed it after his mother.
So everybody knows different bits and pieces, and everybody has slightly different things that it means to you.
You have to
Would
sit on the
anybody
couch
say?
I've heard it. And force people.
And we can't even white the pedestal, which is the same size as the actual
It's
structure.
always great to have an architect.
What happened? What is it?
He knows all
We
the
can't
details.
meet him White was the designer of the architect that designed the pedestal, which is also about the same size as the actual statue. So it's double the height of it.
So the goal of this is we all have slightly different feelings or emotions that it represents. Would anybody say that anything that was said was wrong?
I have something to add. I didn't say anything. I feel like when I see Statue of Liberty, it's nobility and justice. It's all the things that are the best parts of our nation. And welcome to immigrants, but I don't know if anybody said that, right?
So there's lots of different things, and we don't necessarily know all the facts behind it, but it does evoke an emotion that is pretty similar kind of across the board. So my next question is, when you see these images,
Go slower.
what does that make you think?
It's all falling apart.
So you don't even have to use any words, you don't have to use any kind of background, any kind of history, you just tweak a symbol, and it creates an entirely different perspective without spending a whole bunch of time talking about it. What that requires is that we're all on the same page as to what the symbol means. So if we're saying that you can have different understandings of the symbol, but they're not necessarily wrong, but you need to be on the same page, our question is it possible to understand symbols that were used 2,000 years ago, or can we just give them whatever symbol that we think it means? can we just put our own understanding onto it, since we're saying it's a little bit of free form how you interpret it. And before we dive down that road, I would ask, what does this mean to everybody? Just obviously from the groans, there's a pretty stark feeling behind it. But then that leads to the question, what does this mean? If you go to India, you're going to see the same symbol over the doors of temples. So they're not the same thing, but we automatically are going to read immediately into our understanding of this symbol. And we have to be able to step back just a minute and have some type of understanding of what at least the basis of it was, where it came from. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about in particular today related to symbols. The next little bit that is going to be important, and I won't go too much into this because it's a little bit weird, but one of the main features of Hebrew poetry is something called parallelism, which basically means that you use two lines that are very similar to mean one thing. We do that in English when we think about poetry. We think about rhyming, we think about alliteration. Sometimes we even think of a bit of meter or cadence. Roses are red, violets are blue. You pretty much know what the next two lines are going to sound like. That's really familiar for us. We all accept that as being poetic and kind of a style of literature. If you go to Japan, you have something that's slightly different. When I read this, it doesn't automatically jump out as some like poem type of structure. But if you know a little bit about Japanese poetry, you know that it's about the syllables, how many syllables are in each line. And so when you start to translate that into Hebrew poetry, you get things like, why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? So it's two lines that are restating basically the same thing. They run side by side right next to each other. Oh Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? So when you read the Psalms, this is pretty familiar. There's all different kinds. We won't go into it. Some of them are comparisons, some of them are contrasting. But in the book of Revelation in particular, there's a lot of symbology that's placed side by side. And there's a lot of question as to, is this a chronological series of events that are going to repeat themselves over and over and over? Or is this just a method of literature that they're using to stress this same topic and make sure that it's really driving home a point? And this is all gonna come back around in just a little bit, so just tuck it away in your mind for now. One of the other things that I always find really interesting when you're putting yourself in a realm of literature that also shows up in Revelation is there are set phrases that we use as a whole that will help set the stage. So actually, when you look at, if you're thinking about reading stories and whatnot, if you see the word once, what comes next? Wicked.
Stepmother.
Ding, ding, ding. Happily
Ever after.
They all lived happily ever after. So there's these phrases that are automatically built into our kind of collective unconscious that we accept as setting a stage for us and building a foundation for what we're going to read next. And that comes down quite a bit in Revelation. Also, you start reading things like the rich and the poor, the weak and the strong. And that's something that's like throughout kind of Hebrew literature that sets the stage for just the simple meaning of everybody. The last little thing that will come around here in just a bit is the use of scripture. So, the Old Testament is what the Hebrew people had to work with, and Revelation pulls a lot from Old Testament scripture. So there's some things that we're going to go through today that are brand new to Revelation, and there are some things that are pulling from the symbols of the Old Testament. So I really want to talk about that and see if we actually know what's new and what comes from something else. Any questions about that? Anybody have any thoughts, or did that make sense? Kind of putting it in a bit of perspective.
Yep.
So this is pretty boring, but it is very important, especially for next class. So we're going to lay the stage for it right now. But there's 4 ways that are oddly enough named these weird names that people generally use to interpret it, but that's really just fancy ways for saying past, present, future, and always. So there's 4 different groups of people that when they read Revelation, one group sees that it is entirely and has already entirely taken place in the past. There's one group of people that read it and say that from the time it was written until the time Jesus comes back, it is consistently taking place and we are somewhere in the middle of it. And there's a group of people that say if none of it has taken place yet, it's all going to take place at some time in the future. And then there's one group that is saying it's very symbolic and it takes place over and over and over, and the symbols that we're reading are a much larger idea of humankind and the human experience, and it's not a singular event that will only take place.
History repeats itself.
Exactly. So the rise and fall of empires, there's a king, they die, there's another king, they die, it happens over and over again. So I wanted to talk about that kind of as we go through today, because that in particular is going to be next week when we talk about how many times has the world ended. It's going to play into this, so we're kind of laying the groundwork for that today. So all that being said, I wanted to talk specifically, last week we kind of mentioned that some of the more common symbols found in Revelation, these are the ones that I picked because they stand out to me. I wanted to dive at least into a couple of them. I was going to pick the 4 horsemen to start with, if that's okay with everybody, and then we can kind of pick and choose from there where we go.
Then I saw the Lamb open one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures call out, as with the voice of thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there was a white horse. Its rider had a bow, a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. When he opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature call out, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people would slaughter one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature call out, "Come!" And I looked, and there was a black horse. Its rider held a pair of scales in its hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's pay, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay, but do not damage the olive oil and wine." When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice from the 4th living creature call out, "Come!" And I looked, and there was a pale green horse. Its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. With him, they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth.
It's pretty intense. So, do we think that the 4 horsemen made their first appearance in Revelation, or is this the boogeyman of the Old Testament? Has anybody ever heard of the 4 horsemen anywhere else in Scripture? What about the phrase, I looked up again, and there before me were 4 chariots. The first chariot had red horses, the second black, the third white, and the 4th dappled. I asked the angel, "What are these, my Lord?" The angel answered, "These are the 4 spirits of heaven going out from standing in the presence of the Lord to the whole world." How much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword and famine and wild beast and plague, to kill the men and their animals? Fairly similar.
Where is this from?
One is from Zechariah and one is from Ezekiel. And there's another one, a separate one from Zechariah. Before me was a man riding a red horse. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. They are the ones the Lord has sent to go throughout the earth. So everybody thinks of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse as coming straight out of Revelation. The monster under the bed for the Hebrews that has obviously been around and is mentioned in other places in Scripture. We just don't ever quite think about it that way. But we talked about last week how these letters were sent to churches that John was personally involved with, that he knew the people, he knew their history. This was a personal letter for them. So using the images that they are familiar with, it sounds different to us. It may take away some of this like apocalyptic nature of it, but it is something that gets a point home for them. Digging a little bit into the symbology, I just want to talk for a quick minute about the white horse in particular. There's a lot of controversy around the white horse because later in Revelation, Jesus comes riding a white horse. So there's a whole segment of people who interpret this as being one of the that Jesus is actually riding throughout the land, causing some of this to happen. White in and of itself is used more than any other color in Revelation, and every single time that it's used in the context of purity and holiness. So if we look at this, what makes this horse so bad as opposed to everything else in the book that's that's white and pure and correct. So it kind of begs the question, is this not something that's happening not necessarily automatically as the punishment that we take it for, but as the first step to what needs to come next, to a more fulfilled expectation? There's also a couple of things, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but each one of these horsemen was given something. They're given a crown and a bow in this case. And in Greek, there's actually two different words for crown, which don't come across so much in English. But one of the words for crown in Greek was the one that the people who won the Olympics would get, or if you're in some sporting game, the laurel crown. And that means that through your power, you achieved something, that you won something over somebody else. And there's another one, the diadem, which is the crown that the rulers and the government agents, the councils and whatnot would wear. And that represented something that was given to you versus something that you yourself earned. This particular crown is the one that represents the victory over something that he's earned through his own power. It's the Stephanos crown. So basically, even though he was given power to do it, the conquering that he's supposed to take place is through his own ability. And so, to me, those start raising all kinds of different questions, because when I hear the four horsemen of the apocalypse, I automatically think something totally different than what these symbols potentially set the stage for.
The Beatles?
Not quite that different.
Okay.
Any thoughts on that? Anything interesting or unusual, or something you didn't know?
In some ways it makes sense that, not all, they're the apocalypse, that just means the end. It doesn't necessarily mean all four of them have to be bad.
Well, they're not even called we call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. They're just part of they're the first bit of a huge series of events that are taking place. So I think with Revelation, it's easy to read our own social ideology into it. We've heard these things so much that it's automatically there in our mind without actually taking a step back and saying, hey, what's actually...
What about the word for bow? Because, it could be used for hunting or it could be used for war. So does it have a different...
So everything related to this bow is there's actually a group of people on the frontiers of Rome at the time that were super famous for warring with bows. That was what they used to fight with. And so, again, a particular group of people consider this to be a reference to them, that they're the ones who are invading the land, taking the peace, conquering the frontiers, and so they're kind of the opposite of civilized society. If Rome is creating this peace and civilized society, and these people are on the frontiers of that, and they're engaging, that this bow is the symbol for them. The Parthians was their name, but a lot of people consider this, and that's talk about that next time too, because some of the people who think it's taken place in the past consider that the explanation for this horseman, that it was those people who were invading at this time, and that's what this horseman interpreted them. So yeah, just dissecting a little bit of those four options. The people who hold to the past theory think that this entire series of four horsemen can be the first Jewish and Roman war. So the couple of years that existed right before the Jewish temple was destroyed. Rome and Israel were at war with each other quite a bit, a lot of back and forth going on there. And they see these four horsemen as conquering and taking peace and doing all these things, as Rome kind of taking that away from the Jewish people at the time. People who think that it's kind of been in existence from the time it was written until now see this piece as the Pax Romana, which is a larger period of time when Rome was expanding its borders and creating a sense of peace for everybody on the interior, but they were doing that by conquering everybody on the exterior. And so Rome is actually the horseman riding out and taking peace from the other nations, not necessarily Israel, but the other nations surrounding it. The people who think it takes place in the future say it hasn't happened at all yet, and one day there are going to actually be four horsemen that come out of somewhere and do these things. And then the people who see it more metaphorically see it as the concept of war. Like over and over, these horsemen ride out, and some people, this group in particular says that the white horse is conquering and the red horse is also bringing warfare, and the white horse is considered to be doing it with a sense of justice, and so trying to save somebody, trying to fight the good fight, whereas the red horse is warfare for a less noble cause. So to me, these are all good ways you can figure out how and what you hold to, and again, the symbols can all mean a variety of things, but trying to understand a little bit about what they meant and how the people who were originally reading it would interpret it gives us a little bit of an ability to dig into it and see slightly different perspective, or at least doing this has provided me with a slightly different perspective. Any questions on that particular guy? Who wants to pick next?
I kind of want to know about the beast, like that whole thing, because I remember reading about that as a kid and being like, "That's insane." Like,
The sea beast or the
yeah,
market beast?
the sea. Oh, there's so many.
The
sea
tiger?
beast, yeah.
Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. Excuse me. And the dragon gave it its power and its throne and great authority. One of the heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed that beast. They worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?"
So this is a pretty fun image, but I have the question of how do you actually see that beast? 7 heads and 10 horns, and where do all the horns go? And it only references one mouth, so you got 7 heads with only one mouth. So I just can't like really imagine what that actually would have looked like. So this was the closest I could find. That seems reasonable. Any thoughts on the symbols that is being used, or how this was meant to be interpreted, or how somebody might interpret it?
I'm really curious about the one with the mortal wound that had healed itself. If they represent some leaders or somebody, then one of them was almost killed.
That was my first thought. Was like, if there are like multiple heads and if there are multiple crowns, it sounds like a body of people, like an authoritarian body, or perhaps a group of nations or tribes. Like, I don't know, like. If it's written during the time of like the Roman expansion, it would make sense. It would have something to do with like a big shift in power.
Those are actually, the mortal wound part is one of the kind of cool bits of this image that, so some groups of people that take it as having taken place during the expansion, they say the mortal wound was, we talked last week about this being written slightly after the time of Nero, very likely. Nero killed himself. And so when he did that, he had no heirs because he had also killed all of his children because he was crazy. So the Roman Empire to this point had been passed down person to person. So it was the first time that nobody really knew what was going to happen and who was going to be ruling the Roman Empire. And so, there was a bunch of wars between the generals, and eventually one came up and it lasted for another whole long time. But that mortal wound is sometimes thought to be the symbol of when Nero killed himself and everybody thought the Roman Empire was going to be going down the drain, it managed to come back and be hardy and strong for quite a while. Some people consider it to be a symbol of kind of the opposite of Christ. So if the Antichrist is supposed to come around and be the earthly opposite of Christ, then he's supposed to fulfill some of the similar miracles that Jesus did, which was supposedly not Jesus being killed and risen again, and then the Antichrist supposedly being killed, and setting that as the foundation for some of his rise to power. So there's a couple of different ways to look at that. Some of it actually take it as meaning the church itself. So when the temple was destroyed and the Christians were on the run at the time, there's a story that said they fled to a town outside of Israel, and everybody thought they would have disappeared then, and they actually managed to regroup and come back afterwards. name itself has a whole bunch of implications to it. The diadem, the crown that you mentioned, is the one of power, so it symbolizes like it's that earthly rule that has been granted to it, and it even says it in the text that the dragon gave this particular beast his power. So that's kind of falls in line with what we had talked about already. The number 7 is another big thing. This talks about 7 heads, and all throughout scripture, 7 is a very powerful number symbolizing perfection. So you have to ask yourself, if this is the beast that's supposed to be working with the Antichrist, how does he have the perfect number? One of the thoughts on that is that it's perfect power, so like complete control and absolute control versus anything that's pure and holy. Any other thoughts on this guy?
What's the present day people think?
Oh, we'll get to that in 1 second. Let me go back real quick. I did want to ask a question. Does anybody think this is one that came straight out of Revelation, or one that has existed for a while?
Must have existed now.
Anybody else?
Somebody else said yes. I'm back there.
No, this is one that it's included in Daniel quite a bit, and Daniel and Revelation kind of walk side by side, but Daniel was the big prophetic imagery of the time. And so the beast with 7 heads is basically an amalgamation of 4 separate beasts. So when it says it has the paws of this and the skin of the leopard and the mouths of the lion, those are all 4 separate beasts that Daniel had described in pretty well detail. And in Revelation, they smash them all into one weird looking creature.
Well, could that be like, cause some people, I listen to a lot. So, and it's really hard to tell like which is which. So I just figure like in the end, I'm going to figure it out. But it's very interesting to see, to hear everybody's take on it. So like the one person was talking about that the 7 heads are the 7 nations. And like, so when you have the G7 summit, like they're looking at that. And then when they're, so anyway, I'm just very fascinated by like all of their takes on it and like, how's this all work out?
I think it's pretty fascinating too, because going back to Daniel, the 4 beasts, and it says explicitly in Daniel that the 4 beasts represent 4 nations or 4 empires. Mm-hmm. And so with this representing the 4th beast of Daniel, which was identified as Rome, and having the 7 heads, they talk about the 7 first emperors, or the 7 ages, or the 7, there's all, Rome itself is the city on 7 hills, so maybe it's just like reiterating that. So there's all kinds of different ways to dig into it.
Well, and if they're all supposed to be like, because everybody talks about the one world government, so does this beast, when it's describing it in Revelations, is that like the one world government, where it's just like all, like you say, squished together?
Yeah, that's actually one of the thoughts that they say, is since it's squished together all of the 4 beasts that were separate nations, if now it's being put into like one presentation, that it's really just the one single government. And most people take that to mean a government that is not the church, right? The government that stands against Christ, so not necessarily an actual like European Union, United Nations type thing, but just anybody who is non-church focused. But who knows? I have no idea. So yeah, the people who think this is entirely done in the past look at it as being the Roman Empire with the various, the heads representing the various emperors over the course of time. The people who look at it in the present tend to hold that it's the Pope. They look at it as his political and ecclesiastical power over such a large part of the world, which is interesting in and of itself.
It's supposed to be the Antichrist.
A lot of people who look at it in the future say that it is going to be the Antichrist himself, so that in Revelation, the dragon is explicitly said to be Satan. And if Satan grants the power to whomever, that is taken to be the Antichrist, which I'd love to talk about next, unless anybody's really close to that. And then the people who look at it as occurring and reoccurring and metaphoric simply say that it is any ungodly nation, and whether that's an actual political or geographical nation or just any group of people that stand against and oppose the Christian ideology, that they represent that beast. So again, there's tons of different ways to interpret it. All of the symbols can mean different things, but you just kind of have to dig in and figure it out yourself as best you can. Are we okay with the
I wanna
answer?
know about the 666, but that's quick, right?
Can be.
By the signs that is allowed to perform on behalf of the beast, it deceives, do I have the right thing? It deceives the inhabitants of the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that had been wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast could even speak and cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Also, it causes all, both great and small, both rich and poor, to both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a person. Its number is 666.
So first off, is this new to Revelation, or does this exist anywhere else in the Bible?
New Revelation. My guess.
It is new to Revelation. Does everybody see 666 as being the mark of the beast from that passage?
It might not be literal, is what I'm thinking. Because there's lots of powerful numbers actually in people's lives, but it might not even be about like numbers, it would be about something completely different. I don't think they would literally be like taking a tattoo gun and being like 666 on my forehead. I don't know.
No, they got the chip.
Oh my gosh.
I've heard people talk about the 666 is actually representing, how was I going to say it? The people name and the number of letters in each name. Like the first name has 6, the second name 6, so forth.
That's one.
I've heard him use that.
So if you actually read the passage, it says that 666 is the name of the beast, not the mark of the beast. And everybody has taken it to be that they're the same thing. And they might be, but it doesn't actually say that. You don't actually know what the mark of the beast is. John uses 666 as representing the name. And most everybody takes it like you were saying, because if you guys will indulge me.
I was curious about the wound, because they mentioned the wound again.
Like referencing the same beast. So that beast that was wounded is the one who gives and puts the mark on everybody. The beast who was wounded is the one that creates the mark of the beast. To your point, in ancient like Greek and Latin, everybody knows Roman numerals. They all look like letters. In Greek and in Hebrew, there weren't separate numbers. There wasn't a sign for a number. They used letters to represent that. And so one of the big ideas of 666 is that it's the opposite of the 777, which would be perfection, right? So if we just talked about 7 as the sign of perfection and 3 is the sign of God, so the Trinity, etc., that 666 would be just shy of perfection. A lot of people have mentioned that it can be man's symbol because men were created, humans were created on the 6th day, and so it represents just humankind failing to be God, failing to live up to being Christ-like. I think most of those are possible. I tend to shy away, as much as I actually like the concept of it being just shy of perfection, that it's 6 instead of 7. I tend to shy away from that because we see 666 based off our numerical system. But what it actually looked like in Greek is not 3 separate 6s. The way that the math behind it works is each one of those letters represents a piece of math, basically. So when they look at this, they're not seeing just shy of perfection. They're not seeing the symbol that represents perfection. They're seeing a collection of things. Which is what tends to lead people to think that it is some representation of a name. As the whole process kind of flows, where each single letter has a name, you get to 10, and then you don't start over with 11, the next letter is 20, and you go 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 100, and then it's 100, 200, 300. So when you add all those letters together, that's how they come up with these names. So there's been all kinds of people trying to figure out who this represented and whatnot. Anybody know some of the more famous ones that it's supposed to represent?
Yeah.
That's
I
good.
have to share something. I had actually never heard of 666 as a mark of the beast or anything, but my address ends in 6 and my zip code starts with 66. And so when you put it all together, my granddaughter swears that our house is marked by the beast.
In Johnson County.
In Johnson County.
Well, now I know where it's coming from.
There was a bar in Chicago, 666 Lounge, the address was 666. And it was a nightclub. And it's like, come and party in the beast.
I always think it's funny though, people get really caught up in the concept of 666 and finding it like in every little place. And the question is, A, what does the mark of the beast actually mean to you? What does it mean? And then trying to do the math behind it or find out where it actually came from or what it stood for is almost impossible. One of my favorite stories is that, a little bit historical, but there's a church historian, Irenaeus, who was in the 180 sometime. He was taught by a guy who was taught by John. So basically third generation of people who knew each other. So you would think if anybody's gonna know what the 666 means, it would be the people that John himself taught. And Irenaeus wrote a whole book against heresies. And he literally said at the end of the book, he's like, I have no idea who this is. I don't know what this means. He's like, we'll leave this to God. So,
I saw a show one time on it that they said the person, it's like religious, televangelist kind of person, something like that. Okay, so that's the startup. But it was because there was no W in ancient times. You had V, and the letter 6 is VI. It's VI, 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 which is WWW. So
It's the internet.
the internet, and that's the right hand is because most people are right-handed, so it's in their hand or it's in their mind because it's all in the World Wide Web. So you could make a plea for it or a whatever that if you're in the always category, because the World Wide Web, the beast is not, as I understood, is not a thing, but it's a concept. It had no reality, but it controlled everybody's life. It has all of this. So there's an interesting theory behind that. Yeah.
Well, there's another one too, like on the barcodes. Have you heard that one too? That on the barcodes, like if you look, that it's got like a 6 on the both ends, and then there's a barcode that's a 6 in the middle, and then you got all the barcodes in there. So it's like all right there.
You can
find, wow.
Make, you know,
So we're
it's like
already doing it.
any scripture, you can make a ploy for anything if you don't spend the time.
if you try to dig into it at that point, yeah, you can find it anywhere. One of the things about it being put on the hand and on the forehead is in I think it's, Exodus somewhere.
But being left-handed, I'll never have it on
I
my
don't know if I wrote that.
I'm scared from the 6. Somebody said that.
One of the early, I think it's in Deuteronomy maybe when all of the crazy laws are coming down, there's actually a part that says that the good and devout Jews will write the word of God and seal it on their forehead and on their hand.
Yes.
And so this is seen as basically the opposite of that. So if everything that's coming is the Antichrist and the unholy Trinity or whatever you want to call it, then this is the unholy version of that, that the word of not God will be in your thoughts and in your actions, which was the, like you were saying, the symbolism, the actions.
Your
and the
head or
thoughts.
your hand.
So again, even though 666 is a thing specific to Revelation, that it tends to be playing off this concept that they're familiar with of sealing it on your forehead and on your hand. So it's again touching on something that they're very familiar with at the time. Nero, that is one that most of the people nowadays have decided is what the 666 stands for, because if you, I mean, Revelation was written in Greek. 666 we just looked at was in Greek, but if you take Nero and put it into Hebrew and then transliterate it back into Greek, you can get it to be 666 things going on there.
Around the world.
One of the concepts that one of the early church fathers was talking about was that if you take Latinos, which is the Latin word for Romans, that it actually comes out to be 666 also. If you put it in Roman numerals as opposed to Greek numerals, which is what it was written in, so who knows. Your concept about the chip in the hand, the people who think that it's the future, a lot of it is this cashless society because it talks about how you can't buy or sell without the mark of the beast. So using, whether it's a chip or a phone or who knows what, World Wide Web. Throw that one in there. That one's new. I kind of like it, but
It was definitely a thought that ran through my mind when we came out with this real ID.
Yeah.
In the future, are we gonna have real ID only in our hands or forehead?
well, I mean, I have a friend right now he's in Denmark at the moment, and he's like, in the last few months that he hasn't been there, it's been about a year. They've gotten rid of all their post offices and they've gotten rid of all their banks. As a society, they don't have any of it. It's all on their phone, which is
It's
great.
like you could really lose your phone easily that way. And then your whole life is weird.
And the more metaphorical would be any false gods, anything that we put just shy of focusing on God, anything that distracts us away from that. So whether that comes out to be 666 or not, I think is somewhat irrelevant when you're looking at trying to get an actual meaning. If there's, I mean, people for 2,000 years, including the people who were taught by the guy who wrote this book, couldn't figure it out, you have to assume it's somewhat irrelevant at some point, that it's kind of missing the bigger point.
I guess if we kind of think, well, how does God view it? You know, from up above, it looks like 999. But, you know, so.
Oh my God, the whole new interpretation.
It all depends upon your point of view. Is what
Sure,
I'm
but
getting at.
999. No.
I mean, 999 is almost perfect because then when you flip over, you've got all zeros. It's like your car mileage. Jeez, Curtis.
I think, especially with like symbols, it's so easy. I think it's really interesting to like have like the past, the present, like the future, and then the always. Three of those, except for future, kind of seem to be really grounded in like, what does this mean for the way we live our lives now here? And then the future is always kind of like a bit more tantalizing. It's a bit more like, oh my God, this like lion's gonna come out of the ocean, girl. Like, you know, I really like. It's like a lot of fun to like, you know, think about stuff like that, I guess. So I think it makes a lot of sense that people get caught up on these symbols sometimes where they look so deep into it because it's fun to think about.
And it's fun. It's like watching TV. I mean, it's the whole reason that we read books or watch TV is because it gives us something to think about. It's a little bit outside what our day-to-day would be. We tell stories, Little Red Riding Hood, The Big Bad Wolf,
It's like a
Three Little
mystery
Pigs.
novel.
Like, yeah, it all has some meaning. It just happens to be wrapped in this decoration that we understand. And this is the decoration that was understood at that point in time, but it doesn't negate the meaning. The meaning is still there, which is don't put something else before God. Kind of boils down to be pretty straight and simple. Next, anybody want to go through another one? Or
You want to do the Antichrist?
I did. I find the Antichrist pretty fascinating.
That's in this one.
I know who that is now.
Can you tell from the back?
Yeah.
Yeah,
can't?
recognize
Is
it,
that
doesn't it?
My first question is, who thinks the Antichrist is new to Revelation versus already existing in the Bible?
Already existing, right?
I see heads nodding, but nobody's saying anything.
I think there's been many.
Yeah, I think there was like multiple times where like, yeah, there's like an antagonist. Like, there's like this thing that's not what Jesus is, but is like the mirror image of him.
I think they're like foreshadowing Antichrist. So like Hitler was Nero was a foreshadowing of the actual one that's talked about in the Revelations.
Well, fun fact, Antichrist is not mentioned anywhere in Revelation.
That should have been your second question. Who thinks is in the Revelation? Notice I did not read anything.
There's nothing to read.
It was slide 9.
The term Antichrist does not show up anywhere in Revelation.
Does it in earlier books?
It does. It's mentioned 3 times. It's mentioned 3 times in the Bible, all in the letters of John. So I'll read those real quick. Even now there are many antichrists among us. It is the man who denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a man is the Antichrist, which is not one specific person. 1 John 4:3 says, "But every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and even now is already in the world." And then the last time it's mentioned, "Many deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh have gone out into the world. Any such person is the deceiver and is the Antichrist." So we've taken, as a culture, those 3 lines that very clearly to me describe a lot of people and
Attitude.
put it
One
onto
person.
put it onto one boogeyman that's coming down the road, and we're all waiting for it to happen when it actually is happening around us every single day. That to me is fascinating. If you start reading through it and all the interpretations, the various interpretations of who the Antichrist is, etc., I'm going to save that conversation for next week because it plays really big into what we're talking about. And since it doesn't actually show up in Revelation, there's no verse in Revelation to discuss. So we're just going to table that for a moment. But that's something that I find super fascinating that not a lot of people realize that I wanted to make sure we can mention today. Anything else? I know you had mentioned Armageddon last week. Do that one real quick.
Wait a minute. I got eyes. And they assembled them at the place in Hebrew, at that place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. And the 7th angel poured his bowl into the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, "It is done." And there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a violent earthquake, such as had not occurred since people were upon the earth. So violent was the earthquake.
So, is this new to Revelation, or is it working on something that's already existed?
It's got to be old.
Especially in that region, I mean, they're all around the sea, and they all know like the power of like the earth and what the ocean does with the earth. Like, it would make sense that they would like learn about that over time.
Ironically enough, this is the only spot in the entire Bible that Armageddon is actually mentioned. It's this one line.
But just for the record, in the Bible it's H-A-R-M, Armageddon, not Armageddon, as an H
Really?
in this Bible at least.
It is, which is actually a good point because I was going to talk about that. It's written in Greek. It starts with an A, but in Greek, it's called rough and smooth breathing. So, like the author Homer, his name actually starts with an O, but it's got this little breathing symbol on it that you make it the H sound ahead of time. So, I think that's the difficulty in how it's been interpreted as Armageddon versus Armageddon.
You really did a deep dive on this.
Some of this is just collected knowledge over time, but the interesting thing is though when it starts with an H, it actually means something in Hebrew, which is mountain. So Har, H-A-R, means mountain in Hebrew, and people tend to interpret Armageddon as the mountain of Megiddo, which is, I don't know, anybody who's traveled to Israel is one of the big like battlefields outside of Jerusalem, or in Israel, in the north of Israel. The problem is it's not a mountain; it's a flat plain.
If it was a mountain, then Armageddon has already happened.
It's already happened. Narrowed it down. You never know.
Flattened it out.
So again, this is one of those where there's a lot of wordplay involved, and that's what most of the interpretations related to Armageddon as a place tend to be based around. Is that depending on where you put the space in the letters, it can mean the mountain of Megiddo, it can mean the mountain of destruction, it can mean gathering and assembly. there's lots of different ways with the way Hebrew works, which it specifically says is known in Hebrew.
But it never comes across in popular culture as a place. It always comes across
As an event.
the end times. Armageddon means end times, not it.
Is that where the Euphrates goes? Does the Euphrates
Nearby.
run?
Close by. So in Israel, Euphrates doesn't run right through that, but it's pretty close by. And a lot of the last trumpets and the bowl plague, so mentioned the Euphrates as part of it.
You know it's drying up.
So yes, it is drying up, which is one of the, I mean, all the rivers are drying up these days, but the Euphrates drying up is one of the bowl plagues. Interestingly enough, so the Hebrews were captured and put enslaved in Babylon for all the time of like Daniel and that time period. When the Persians invaded Babylon, which eventually led to freeing the Israelites, they actually diverted the course of the Euphrates so they could walk into the city under the gate that the river used to flow in. And so a whole bunch of people think that that concept of drying up the Euphrates is basically preparing for an attack, because that's what saved the Israelites in the past. And that's a symbol that they were very aware of, that was how they were allowed to come back to Israel. So a plague of drying up the Euphrates is a very I mean, that's like crossing the Red Sea, drying up the Euphrates, very similar, both leading to the freedom of the Israelites, both having a continuing history, you know, throughout the
Also,
Jewish lower church.
Hezekiah's time. The fact that there was a king named Hezekiah who, when Jerusalem was sure to be attacked by armies of the north, he knew the spring of water was outside the city gates, and so he had this amazing engineering marvel and dug a tunnel through rock so that the spring could flow down into Jerusalem. They actually did gravity and made it lower in Jerusalem, so they knew how to leave the city gates, and therefore were not vulnerable to attack. I think Israel's very aware of how they get water, right? Like water is that makes a lot of sense to me.
I just thought that was interesting because, you know, when Israel is freed from Egypt, the Red Sea is dried up and they walk across. When Israel was freed from Babylon, the Euphrates was dried up and they were able to leave. And then now this is you know, a next salvation, a next safety. So yeah, as far as the Battle of Armageddon, so to speak, the one look at it is the actual destruction of the temple in Jerusalem when the Romans invaded and destroyed it completely.
70.
And a lot of that is based off, you know, what Jesus actually said, not one single stone of this building will remain standing while you're still alive. And so that's a lot of the kind of the proof points of people who use this method of interpretation. There's one group that considers the defeat of the Turkish Empire as part of this because of some of the directions coming from the east, crossing the Euphrates, et cetera, that all actually plays into this interpretation. And was kind of when
Israel.
No, yeah, that's exactly it.
Is that where you were going?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm free to jump in.
We'll just skip that slide.
Since everybody knows this, we'll just move on. There is actually, like we had talked about, there's a huge plain in northern Israel that a lot of people, and historically many battles have been fought there over time. So this futurist group thinks that they will physically gather at this point and spot in time to have a giant battle. And then kind of the metaphor uses, instead of the place, Har-Megiddo, as a mountain, they use it as the Mount of Slaughter, and it sets it as allusion to any time or place that, you know, Christians are being persecuted, that we're having to fight and sacrifice, or, you know, in any moment in time that this occurs, which tends to happen repeatedly throughout time. There's a few more, we can go into more, we can talk about the churches, or this, the trumpets and bowl plagues real quick. I don't know if you guys want to keep digging into the other three slides that are here.
What's the second one?
The second one is the second coming of Christ, and then right below that is the rapture, and then the lady and the dragon.
Do you want to do the second one, Randall?
Even that, the Lady and the Dragon. I've been watching Harry Potter all weekend. That might be something to cover with that.
Do we have a second?
Second coming.
Oh, okay. So So that is,
While she's looking it up, is this new to Revelation or pre-existing?
Pre-existing, so I'm not afraid.
and then I looked, and there was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a golden crown on his head, and a sharp sickle in his hand. That's really it. There's another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud, "Use your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, because the harvest of the earth is fully ripe."
Yeah, so it is pre-existing. That concept of reaping and sowing is one that comes around quite a bit. And then the next line right after that's talking, it says, "Take your sickle and reap," and then the next one is stomp the grapes, basically. All the wine vat is full, crush all the grapes and turn into wine. And both of those are symbols that have been used kind of throughout time, or throughout the Old Testament. In Jeremiah, it talks about the daughter of Babylon is like a threshing floor. At the time it is trampled, the time to harvest her will soon come. And in theory, well, in Revelation, there's actually 2 times that Christ come back down. So we always talk about the second coming as being the second time Christ comes back. This return and reaping is the second coming, and then again at the later on in the story when he comes to do battle with evil. And so the second coming of Christ, as it's mentioned here, with the reaping of the sanctified, or whatever you want to call it, and the crushing of the wines, is a symbol of basically taking and protecting the people who have done what you wanted them to do, and punishing the wicked for it. And that's a symbol that kind of goes throughout Old Testament literature. The idea of the Son of Man, the idea of the Son of Man is, and Daniel also, that's where that starts from, is one like the Son of Man, and nobody really kind of understands what they're talking about with that, because there's a lot of different allusions to what that means. However, currently, it's all interpreted. Some of it is the sacrifice of Israel after the destruction, that basically the concept of the nation of Israel disappeared at that point. There was no real Jewish nation. There was no temple, which was what the basis of everything had been. There was a total kind of loss of identity. And that's, according to the people who say this in the past, this was like the ultimate end times of everything. The people who see this as still continuing look at it as how the power of the gospel is moving throughout the land and converting and changing and bringing in, like reaping what you have sown. Basically, the harvest is ripe, and so we're going to continuously bring in people. The ones in the future look at it as truly the judgment of Christ. Those who are saved will be taken to heaven, and those who are not saved will be trampled underfoot. And the always camp say that it is just kind of the continual victory of good over evil, which happens all the time, hopefully.
This is only one.
Any questions on that one? Want to do the dragon?
Are we good to move on?
I just wanted to ask about, at some point, it seems like Jesus says that there will be a second coming. You know, in his, do you think Jesus' second coming is like any of these theories? You know? Yeah, I mean, he didn't describe it a whole lot, did he? Or did he include the judgment in it?
No, he actually Jesus didn't talk too terribly much about it. So the whole concept comes from like Thessalonians. Paul's actually talking about it and sets up the scene. So all the image that we have of Jesus coming back like a blazing with eyes of blazing fire, etc. That imagery goes back to Daniel, because that's how he was described, as like a bronze furnace. And the concept of it comes from Paul, as he's writing to the Thessalonians, that one day we will be taken up to heaven, because when Jesus talks about it, it's mostly that you'll pass away before, or the world will pass away, which can mean a lot of things. But the concept of Jesus coming down out of heaven on the clouds, etc., was first talked about in Thessalonians.
And that's different than the rapture, because it's two different events.
So the second coming of Christ and the rapture tend to tie hand in hand, because the reaping of the harvest is what most Christians consider to be being pulled out, when those who are saved are taken to heaven. And then Jesus comes, there's the tribulation period of when all the plagues and bowls and all of that stuff happens. And then Jesus comes back to do the final battle with.
Can I read this section of the rapture? Just because I'm sure that's pretty curious to look. It's in chapter 20. It says, they came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Is that right? Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years.
And that has sparked a whole bunch of conversation too, because the concept of a first resurrection versus a second resurrection is like, how do you kind of navigate that if you say it's only people who have died already get saved, they get resurrected, but the people who are currently living have to go through all of this? Or does everybody who believes in Christ get saved from having to go through all of this turmoil, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a bunch of, because of the way that it's worded and the way that the timing happens. If you want to check it out, 2 Thessalonians 1, 7 through 8 is where the image of Jesus coming back in the cloud comes from. It says, this will happen when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven in blazing fire with his powerful angels. He will punish those who do not know God and do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus. And so that's the imagery comes from that bit.
Second Thessalonians what?
1, 7, and 8.
I always wonder whether it doesn't seem like in the Gospels that there was a whole bunch of punishment wound in that, And is this a inheritance from the Old Testament, or is it just humanity that always has the impulse to divide, conquer, and punish?
I mean, I can answer that from my perspective and how I feel. I don't know if you want to answer it more directly, but my thought is this comes from a group of people. So you have the Israelites who have consistently done battle throughout time to maintain themselves as a national identity. And they've constantly been able to overcome that. And so even though these are Christians at the time, it's still that Jewish identity that they have. And so they've kind of shifted from we're being persecuted because we're Jews to we're being persecuted because we're Christians, but we still believe that somebody's going to come. Throughout Hebrew history, you have the Messiah who comes and saves them, and whether that's Christ or otherwise, depending on how you interpret that as an Israelite, as a Jew. As a Christian, we interpret it as Christ coming to save us. And so I think it is just that need for people to know that they're going to be protected at some point in time. For me, I apply I'm of the always camp. I think a lot of these things are repetitive and it's up to us to live them daily, that it's our duty to fight to make sure that the people around us are comfortable and taken care of, that they're not being persecuted in whatever way that may be. And so it's always nice to think that somebody's going to come to your aid and help you. It's nice for me to think that if I'm in trouble, somebody's going to do that same thing for me. It's nice for me to think that if I'm trying to do that for somebody, I'm going to have people in my church and whatnot that will come and support me in that. And so I really think that the historical concept that they have lived through just fed into that from their stories. Like, we don't have stories. Americans don't really have stories about being saved from, as a country, but we have stories about, the huntsman saving Little Red Riding Hood when she was in trouble. And that is kind of our versions of people saving us on a day-to-day basis. And that's just my thought. I don't know if anybody else has any, but
I agree with him.
I did read this really interesting article one time. We were talking about it yesterday, actually. Anthropologically speaking, nobody should know anything about the Israelites. They were a tribe of hundreds of tribes that existed in that same time and that same place that we don't know much of anything about. So the fact that we know anything about them, let alone that they're a reformed, like they have reclaimed a national status, says something. Like that's a big deal. That's not something that has happened at any other time or any other group of people. So this like need to be saved or desire and expectation to be saved, this like willingness to fight until that happens, I think is what has created that, and I think that's why they've hung on to it for so long.
They're also, for the time that they existed, the first peoples that suddenly said, we have one God, and our God is more powerful than all the other gods, and our God cares about us. Whereas like all the other gods were worshipped and people tried to fall on their mercy for deliverance, and there were multiple gods and they had all the power. Like today I was saying in my sermon, they had power over, they were not in relationship with. Our Israelites' God was unique in that it was wanted relationship with a people, and those are the people. That's who we are today. So.
And also the Israelites are the ones that have maintained their original language all these years.
They have recreated their original language. So Hebrew actually, by the time the New Testament was written, Hebrew was not a spoken language anymore. Nobody actually knew how to speak Hebrew. They knew how to, the priest could read what was written, but nobody spoke it on a day-to-day basis. So the New Testament was written in Greek because that's what everybody spoke. So they have recreated based off scripture their language. So it is one of the oldest languages around because they've been able to recreate it.
But they seem to have a compulsion to write everything down. Which is why we know about it.
I mean, that's part of the reason that they've survived too, is because they wrote everything down, and not only wrote everything down, but claimed it as holy. So that, if you go to Nineveh or somewhere, there's just as many king's lists and genealogies and all these things, but they've been buried for thousands of years and nobody's thought twice about it. But the Israelites' versions of the same thing is in the Old Testament because they took it as holy. It was important to them. It wasn't just something that they were writing down to write down. They wrote it down for a reason, which was that to maintain that relationship.
And they never claimed that an emperor was God,
Yeah.
right? Like I think the difference with like Egyptians is when it wasn't the king, the pharaoh was supposed to be God. So
one of the other interesting things I find about the Old Testament and Hebrew literature is they're also one of the few ancient nations that were willing to accept that, to your sermon today, were willing to accept mistakes. So the Egyptians, if the pharaoh did something they didn't like, they would go and chisel his name off the wall like he didn't exist anymore.
and if Pharaoh was supposed to be God, but then he got beaten in a war or something, then how do you reconcile the fact that he was so powerful when he was dead, right? Like whereas the Israelite guy, God never died because he was never embodied in a person, and then it was embodied in a person. That person was resurrected. So,
and they were willing to separate themselves but maintain that relationship with God. I think is one of the most important reasons that they have survived.
I think it's funny that they basically got remembered for like being dramatic. Like they're like, yeah, our God's like the God and like the most powerful, and we are holy, and like everybody was like, yeah, girl, and they like wrote that shit down. Like, sorry, y'all.
I don't care.
Sorry, my French.
I just love the girl on the end of her name. Yeah, girl.
I'm intrigued. He speaks my language.
It's true though, because there's nothing about Revelation that's anything but dramatic.
Something that, on the lines of dramatic, I've watched some TV shows where they, are trying to figure out the 7 plagues of Egypt. I've gone way back, not to Revelation, but it's in some respects they're saying these things happen, and they can follow suit, but it's not Cecil B. DeMille, it's not the Red Sea parting and the walking through. It's basically the wind blew back on this rise, and so it's able to. So it's, and I don't know who the pastor was, but we had it might have even been Chase that made a comment that not everything in the Bible is as dramatic as we've been told it has been.
I mean, everybody likes a good story.
Yeah. I like special effects.
I mean, Manny yells at me all the time because he's like, I was there with you, and I would never have told this story the way you did. It's a much better story, but I'm like, everybody likes a good story. That's what keeps people
Embellishment
around.
is part of the sound.
I'm like, we know how to tell a story. I mean, that's really true, but that's also part of the reason that they were able to keep it going for so long, right? If it was just, oh, we kind of crossed this river and walked for a little while, like, that's not quite the same gist as the whole Exodus story.
Took a left turn at Albuquerque and got lost. Well, I think Jesse's made this point before too, that God's time is a lot longer than we want to have, 7 years or 40 years in the wilderness as opposed to, I just want to get there in a couple hours. When did they take a plane? So, I mean, the whole thing of some of the Bible stories may not have been as dramatic, the Christmas story with the angels coming down may not have been quite that dramatic of a story, but still, we want to see it that way every year.
And I think that's part of the whole concept of symbolism, the whole once upon a time aspect of it, is that it becomes part of that memory, and every time we tell it, we just add, we don't want it to be boring. You've heard this story 10 times, we don't want it to be boring this time, so we're going to add just a little bit more. And add just a little bit
You
extra.
gotta pay the audience if they're falling asleep.
And the
Throw a
story
dragon in.
in Mark and Matthew, we're gonna
Dragon
make it a shrieking woman through the public eye.
I was going to be real quick about this, but I think this is kind of an important aspect to deal with in Revelation 2. Going back to the parallelism that we talked about, how you say one thing one time and say it again, slightly different words. Later in the book, if you look, there's 7 trumpets and 7 bowls, and each one is released, and it's a new plague of God, and everyone is very dramatic, and there's fire and smoke everywhere. And if you put those side by side, you kind of wonder, are they telling the same story twice? The first one is a little bit awkward. Hail and fire versus painful sores. So, leave some questions to be answered. But then you get into the second plagues and the second bowl. A fiery mountain was thrown into the sea, and the sea turned to blood, versus the sea turned to blood, and every living thing died. Those sound pretty similar to me. A great star blazing like a torch fell, and the rivers and springs turned bitter. The rivers and springs of water were turned to blood. Sun, moon, and stars are struck and turned dark. That's a whole long passage, so I paraphrase that, but that's where you can find it. The sun scorches people with fire and intense heat. Everything dealing around the sun and the moon. The next one, a star, which is later in that verse represented as an angel, opened the abyss, the sky darkened, and locusts came down upon the earth, versus the throne of the beast is plunged into darkness, and the people had pains and sores. The 9:3 talks about how the locusts were attacking the people and with painful sores and whatnot. So if you read those two, they kind of compare side by side. And then going back to the Euphrates, the angels at the Euphrates were unleashed with their armies, versus the water of the Euphrates were dried to prepare the way for the kings. And then the last one in each one, the last trumpet initiates the eternal worship of God Almighty, and the last bowl is a great singing from heaven that it is done. We are done with all of this. Now we can move on to this eternal phase of life. I read those side by side. I kind of doubt they're going to turn the oceans to blood twice. That seems redundant. Or all the springs and waters, or that the sun is going to be darkened twice. I could be wrong. I have no idea. But to me, this just seems like adding to that literary aspect of good storytelling and the method of storytelling that they're accustomed to. And when we tell a story, if we put it in rhyme, or we put it in kind of the Jack and Jill meter, or whatever you want to call it, you know that it's a story. You know that you're reading this with a little bit of symbolism behind it. You're not necessarily expecting it to happen word for word. It sets the stage for, there's a little bit of storytelling going on here. So if it's being put in a way that the people reading it automatically see it as being a story, then they can take it as symbolism. They can take it as this greater message, aside from trying to figure out exactly when the dragon is coming and who he is. They're looking at the theme of the story and the moral of the story versus the actual events of the story.